Thanks, Christina, for your introduction and for asking me to present today. It's a great honour. You'll forgive me if I'm a little nervous. I'm talking to you today from our broadcast studio here in Kildare House, and this is a little outside my comfort zone. Usually on a day like this, I'm standing in the production gallery shouting down the earpiece of whoever has the misfortune to sit in this chair. So this is a little bit like karma getting its revenge on me today. Just to fill out my resume a little, I began working in the broadcasting industry 22 years ago as an archive assistant for a sports magazine show called Breaking Ball, if you can believe that, which was shown on our national broadcaster RTE and was produced by a company called Setanta Television. Over the next 9 years with Setanta, I became firstly a studio producer director before becoming an outside broadcast director looking after live match presentation. When I left the company, I worked freelance as a producer and director across a variety of channels, including RTE, TG Cahir, which is the Irish language broadcaster, as well as working as a television and screens consultant in the commercial sector. So over 7 years ago, I was made aware of an opportunity that had become available with the House of the Oireachtas, and I exchanged the fluid, exciting, dynamic world of live sports broadcasting for the even more exciting world of parliamentary broadcasting. Joking aside, I'd always been a political junkie, and for me, it was a brilliant opportunity and an easy decision to make. So I work for the Houses of the Oireachtas, the National Parliament. It has two plenary chambers, the Dáil, which is the main legislative chamber, and the Seanad or upper house. There are 4 committee rooms in which there are over 20 committees, usually scheduled to sit during a regular week. The Parliament has cameras in all chambers and rooms, and all of the proceedings, plenary and committee, are separately streamed live to our website, oireachtas.ie. We also have our own television channel, Oireachtas TV, which is a curated live feed of proceedings and is made available on the 3 main digital broadcast platforms in Ireland, Sairview, Sky TV and Virgin Media, as well as on a number of smaller online-only platforms and our own website. When live proceedings are finished, we show recordings of business which we weren't able to show at the time that it took place. But we are also a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week channel, which means that we can't survive on live proceedings and repeats alone. We also produce ancillary programming, interstitial material and content from other sources. I'm talking to you today, as I said, from our broadcast studio here in Kildare House, which we use for many of our productions. Oireachtas TV as a standalone parliamentary broadcaster and how we engage with the public is what I want to speak to you about today. But first, let me take a little time to show you all what we try and do here at Oireachtas TV. Firstly, what is parliamentary broadcasting? On the face of it, this seems to be a fairly easy question to answer, and years ago perhaps was. As the demand for televised political coverage grew in the 70s and 80s, parliaments around the world realised the power of the medium and began having cameras installed in chambers or asking companies to do so for them. It wasn't until 1990 that the Oireachtas opted to have the first cameras installed here in the Dáil chamber. But installing cameras is only the start of the broadcasting process. Recording and archiving video and audio from a parliamentary chamber is one thing, but control of the method of the delivery is another. While most parliaments have opted to install equipment themselves and control those cameras and recorders themselves, how those pictures are displayed to the public can happen in a number of ways. Remember, the dilemmas that democratic parliaments face when looking to broadcast. Firstly, there is no inbuilt institutional knowledge in most civil services around broadcast technology, so they must rely, at least initially, on contractors to install and operate cameras and servers to record on. Secondly, a sitting Parliament produces an inordinate amount of live content. And while its broadcasting is probably the closest thing we have to what we would define as public service broadcasting, a lot of it is not of huge interest to the casual viewing public, nor is it easily scheduled, given the propensity for business in the chambers to run over time. What platform has the capacity to show all this material in a coherent and intelligible way? Thirdly, who owns it? Not just in the sense of who's providing the finances behind it, but editorially, who directs the material? What production values can they bring to it? What additionality can be given to it? Again, the expertise here is not something that is asked about in civil service exams, and it's probably the element that is most vital to successful public engagement through broadcasting. Well, question one is usually answered by the Parliament tendering for facilities and operational resources, as the Irish Parliament did in 1990. So, under a rolling contract, the provision of these services are kept in-house, so the Parliament itself controls, provides and archives its own signal of proceedings. In our case, a company called Pi Communications have been providing facilities for us for over a decade. Question two has been answered by the internet and YouTube. Any Parliament which produces its own signal can get it online. It may be the barest of coverage, but it is still available. But does availability to the public equate to engaging with the public? So we move to question three. Who owns, produces and controls it editorially? There are a number of different models in the UK, and I know there's a lot of people on this call from the UK who I recognise, and they'll correct me if I'm wrong. The Westminster Parliament shows all of its proceedings live on its website, but also makes the signal available to the BBC, where it is shown to viewers as BBC Parliament, a service which I believe is now online only, although BBC News Channel often opts into it live. It is BBC staff as the UK's national broadcaster who mediate and produce that final product for a television audience. In North America, both C-SPAN in the US and CPAC in Canada were creations of a subsidy levelled on cable TV companies, and the two channels had to be carried by law on all cable subscription packages. But there is a degree of separation between the stations and the parliaments in question. The US Congress and the Canadian Parliament do not own C-SPAN and CPAC, although they do provide them with the feeds of proceedings. This allowed a degree of critical independence in their programming. The budgets available to them, coming from private companies rather than the public purse, also allowed them to be multi-channel operations, with a lot of the style of the presentations closer to modern-day news productions, with all the advantages that entails for engaging with the public brought up on rolling 24-hour news cycles. In France, LCP and Public Sénat were set up at the end of the 1980s under statute, and their formation is more analogous to how Oireachtas TV came into being. But there are differences. Firstly, their budgets are much larger. Secondly, both legislative chambers have their own channels, which operate completely separately of the other. And thirdly, their remit for public engagement is much wider, with a slate of programming ranging from parliamentary proceedings to internally financed feature films. Oireachtas TV was set up by the Broadcasting Act of 2009 and is financed from the houses of the Oireachtas Civil Service budget. Cameras have been in our chambers from 1990, web streams had been available from the early 2000s, but the vast majority of Irish citizens had only ever interacted with the Parliament through clips provided for use on RTE on the nightly news. Oireachtas TV was a move towards owning and directing the coverage of the Parliament end to end. While feeds were still, of course, being provided to national broadcasters, Oireachtas TV was where an unfiltered view of Parliament could be made available to the public. Its remit was not journalistic, its remit was to promote the proceedings of the Parliament and the democratic process generally. Oireachtas TV went on air in 2014. I was appointed in January 2016. I had viewed the channel before my interview and I had a lot of strong opinions about what could be done with it. But perhaps the strongest impulse I had was to recognise that if you're in the TV business, you better act like you're in the TV business. The fact that the Parliament was looking to hire in external expertise showed that they recognised that as well. When you commit to owning a television station, as the Parliament had, you commit to growing an entity which has technical and aesthetic standards, which needs a rigorous editorial policy, and if it is to be a long-lasting project, must be always looking at what future trends will bring in the broadcast industry in order to shape the channel to meet them. If we did not recognise these things, that we should have up-to-date graphics, a coherent schedule, ideas around new programming, and a process to develop the channel infrastructure in the long term, then public disengagement would be our problem. Overall, we needed to define a sense of mission for ourselves. I remember I attended a conference of parliamentary broadcast managers in Ottawa in 2018. The representative from CPAC shared with us a marketing campaign that had been successful for them in the previous year. The gist being that CPAC was long-form political coverage. I liked the idea of that, but I recognised the limitations of that view when applied to our own circumstances in Oireachtas TV. Firstly, the editorial separation between CPAC and the Canadian Parliament allowed the type of in-depth, journalistic-style coverage that they were alluding to in the slogan. We are not set up to have an opinion agenda. Secondly, long form doesn't describe the many hours of parliamentary proceedings that are only of interest, honestly, to the speakers themselves and the parliamentary record. As broadcasters, we shouldn't kid ourselves about the nature of what we broadcast. In the main, parliamentary broadcasting is a niche part of the industry. The ability to sell a product starts with believing in the product itself, whatever the difficulties it may present for a marketing strategy. My own view of the channel was that we would recognise that many of our citizens would rarely have occasion to interact with us, but there would also be moments when all our citizens would need to, and we would have to be ready in those moments with coverage of the highest standard. Outside of those moments, we would try and present a schedule that not only reflected the concerns of the Irish people at the time, but would also present a different view of the Parliament than perhaps seen previously through news clips and current affairs programmes on the other terrestrial stations. The hashtag we use is See for Yourself. We could see many opportunities for development in both our content and how we delivered it. The first area we looked at under content was our editorial policy. When I first arrived in the broadcasting unit of the Oireachtas, there was a fairly hard and fast rule that the proceedings of the Dáil, the main legislative chamber, would have primacy on the channel. As a rule of thumb, I agree with that. Set-piece business such as leaders' questions will always garner the most interest from the public. However, we were missing opportunities when committees were sitting at the same time as other Dáil business. At the time of my arrival, a committee investigating the root causes of the banking collapse in Ireland was wrapping up, but most of the coverage had been seen in clips on terrestrial newscasts rather than as centrepieces of Oireachtas TV's schedule. In consultation with the head of communications, my line manager, the long-suffering Derek Dignam, we instituted a policy where the national news agenda could be a determinant factor on our editorial decisions. This has led to numerous memorable days on the channel, from the farcical our football FAI boss John Delaney sitting in front of a committee for 6 hours and refusing to answer any questions, to the historically significant, the charged testimony that took place in front of the committee to repeal the 8th Amendment in the run-up to the abortion referendum. We have to consider our audiences. If they are coming to us on a specific day because of the biggest current news story, not only do we risk disappointing them if it is not there in favour of an arcane piece of business in a half-empty Dáil chamber, but we also risk the Parliament itself looking out of touch with the people. And most members will tell you that they want more focus on the work they do in committees anyway. As I mentioned before, the necessity to provide a 24/7 schedule to our platform providers means that we can't get by on live proceedings and repeats alone. The need to provide ancillary programming is, of course, another opportunity to engage with the public outside our normal environment of parliamentary proceedings. Soon after I started, we began a monthly studio discussion programme called Oireachtas TV Debates, which allowed us to do a number of things. Firstly, to give a changing channel a new visual personality, helped by our colleague Flor McCarthy, who presents for us. It gives us an opportunity to present proceedings in the chambers in a different context by examining external factors, whether that be Brexit, the global geopolitical situation, or constitutional issues. And it also allowed us to differentiate our coverage from other broadcasters. As I already said, our remit is to promote Parliament and the democratic process, which means that we must be resolutely apolitical. In light of that, we adopted an editorial motto which was, "We deal with process, not policy." The effectiveness of this approach was seen during the abortion referendum campaign. While the other channels were hosting adversarial debates, we concentrated on how such an issue had come to be decided in a referendum, which led to us concentrating our discussions on the Citizens' Assembly, which had recommended that a referendum take place, and on the effectiveness of the committee to investigate the repeal of the 8th Amendment. It was a type of coverage that audiences were not getting elsewhere. We have also greatly extended coverage of report launches and press conferences, as well as extending an open invitation for chairpersons to come in to us for one-on-one interviews on the work that is done by committees. Another initiative that we began was to engage with the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. For nearly the past 20 years, the BAI have administered the Sound and Vision Fund, a source of finance which is made available from the television licence fee. The basic structure is this. Independent producers can pitch TV channels ideas for programming, which, if the channel likes the pitch and agrees to contribute between 10 and 15% of the cost, can then be submitted to the BAI. If the pitch and budget pass the BAI criteria, then the remaining 85 to 90% is provided for production to begin. As a public service broadcaster, Oireachtas TV was entitled to access these funds, but had not done so before. This was a game changer for us. It allowed us to tap into the pool of incredibly talented independent programme makers here in Ireland, while giving us prestige content for the channel and our website at a fraction of the cost of the taxpayer that individually commissioning programmes would cost. It also allowed us to make a great contribution to some of the amazing programming that has documented the last decade of commemorations here in Ireland. In the past 6 years, we've supported 10 major programming projects, either with the BAI alone or in conjunction with other broadcasters. To give you a brief flavour of these programmes, in A Woman's Place, the documentary makers from EMM Productions asked all female members of the Dáil and Seanad to sit for a group portrait, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of universal suffrage. The finished painting was then donated to the houses and is hung at the bottom of the ceremonial staircase in Leinster House. In The 7 Ages of Noel Browne by Yellow Asylum Films, found footage of a long-ago interview with one of Ireland's most iconoclastic TDs, the late Noel Browne, became the centrepiece of an extraordinarily moving film which received its premiere in the Cork Film Festival in 2021, attended by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. And in State of Flux, the producers from Loose Horse TV combined documentary-style research and a live theatrical recreation to give new life to the treaty debates a century after partition divided the island of Ireland. These programmes and more are available on the channel and our website. We've also undertaken projects that we could loosely group under the title Open Parliament, and which refers back to my ambition for the channel to offer new perspectives on the parliamentary experience. We now regularly produce coverage not just of significant parliamentary events, but around them. So, for instance, on the first day back of the Dáil after an election, we are live before the session starts, outside and inside the houses, interviewing new arrivals and returning personalities. On Budget Day, we provide context on the process of compiling a budget with a live programme before the speeches. For state visits and special addresses to the houses, whether it be Pelosi, von der Leyen or Zelensky, we are providing additionality and extra programming around all these events, and in the process allowing the public access into the Parliament that had never been there previously. We've also taken advantage of the opportunity that the decade of commemorations has provided. It was up to us as a Parliament and as a station to promote and celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Dáil in 2019 and the Seanad in 2022. Both events allowed us a chance to put the Parliament at the forefront of the national conversation. While the 2 days were significantly different from each other, at the heart of each production was the desire to give a different perspective on Parliament. So, for Dáil 100, as part of the biggest production we have ever undertaken as a channel, we endeavoured to transport viewers back to the afternoon of the 21st of January 1919 by holding a special sitting live from the Mansion House, the original site of the first Dáil meeting. This live outside broadcast involved us converting the venue back towards its earlier iteration, and also contained live musical, dramatic and spoken word performances and video inserts, along with all the trappings of a parliamentary sitting. The broadcast was live on Oireachtas TV and carried on RTE as a simulcast. For Seanad 100, which was a more low-key affair, we installed new mobile cameras into Leinster House to give the viewing public a fresh view on the chambers and on the musical performances which were also part of the day. These were combined with recorded video elements that were played live into the chamber during the sitting, which made it an unusual experience for both the members and the viewing audience. These types of events really give us a chance to stretch our legs and to show ourselves in our best light. It should be noted that neither of these days or the numerous other events that we cover would happen without the support and assistance of the staff of the House of the Oireachtas service, from the clerks of the Dáil and the Seanad on down. One of the other ways that we leverage our content is through our educational outreach programme. So, for instance, for Dáil 100 using the BAI fund, we also commissioned an animated film which detailed the events of that first sitting, which was then shown on the channel but also made available to schools with lesson plans and other support materials for teachers drawn up by our education officer, Conor Rail. We've done this with a number of projects, including 2 animated series on the political process aimed at primary and secondary school students respectively. This is a great example of content sourced by the channel having a real vital afterlife and allowing us to be part of the students' curriculum. Finally, in terms of content, we've built a really strong relationship with international institutions like the EU Parliament and the Council of Europe. Explaining how our own Parliament and members interact with these types of bodies is an important goal for us. We are fortunate that we have a great relationship with the EU Parliament staff in their Dublin office, and they keep us up to date on upcoming events which we can add to our live schedule, such as the President of the Commission's State of the Union speech each year. We've also regularly recorded studio debates from Strasbourg, and we've also produced documentaries on our delegation's work with the Council of Europe. We're always looking to expand our international coverage, so this talk might just be the start of a long relationship with IPU in that respect. So that is what we are doing in terms of content. In terms of delivery, the ever-changing nature of the broadcasting industry means that how audiences consume is equally as important as what audiences consume. To that end, we're about 7 years into a 10-year research and capital spending project in order to make sure that we are in a position to react to changes in those patterns of consumption. This comes back to what I was speaking about before. Setting up a television station puts you in the television business, whether it is staffed by contractors or civil servants. This programme has seen us update our studio gallery and studio floor, install a new media asset management system, a new recording and archiving solution, and a new transmission solution, although amazingly, we still couldn't figure out how to do a Zoom meeting this morning. The significance of these improvements for public engagement lies in the fact that we are in a position to deliver content across a range of media, in a variety of formats and resolutions. So viewers can access the Oireachtas TV stream online on oireachtas.ie and via our app, as well as on broadcast platforms. Our next project is looking at installing an IP infrastructure in our production galleries. Not to get too technical, but the broadcast industry is on the cusp of a major change in how it delivers its signal. IP is about to become the new standard, and this will have huge implications for how viewers access programming in the coming years. It is also part of the major redevelopment of the industry driven by the remote participation necessitated by COVID. Apart from the technical end of things, we have developed a much closer relationship with our website team editorially over the past few years, led by our colleague Karen Hooley. How we display our channel content on the site and synchronise our coverage with the web and social media channels has led to far more effective promotion of events, which is always useful when you're working without a dedicated marketing team or advertising budget. One of the great success stories of how we have changed delivery in order to improve public engagement with the channel is around Irish Sign Language and our relationship with the deaf community. The passing of the Irish Sign Language Act in 2018 obligated all public bodies to put in place policies to ensure access for the deaf community. And as a channel regulated by the BAI, Oireachtas TV already had in place targets we had to meet for the provision of both signed and subtitled content. Given my experience in the area, I was asked to participate in the working group looking at ISL provision in the houses of the Oireachtas and contributed to the final report. At Oireachtas TV, we'd already taken the decision that all major events, including the budget, special sittings and joint addresses to the houses, would have ISL coverage as standard. But we were working with freelance interpreters who could be difficult to source at times. The working group's report recommended that the Oireachtas hire 2 full-time ISL interpreters to work across the houses, but to be based mostly in Oireachtas TV. The arrival of Caroline O'Leary and Ciara Grant as senior and junior interpreters respectively has been a hugely progressive step for us in the channel. Not only does it guarantee us a minimum level of coverage for essential proceedings each week, but part of their remit was to reach out to bodies like the Centre for Deaf Studies in Trinity College and to put in place intern programmes in order to encourage more interpreters to go towards a career in broadcasting. They've done this very successfully for the past 2 years. Finally, their presence on the team and in our editorial meetings has put Irish Sign Language and its provision at the heart of our decision-making processes. They are passionate advocates for the deaf community and are constantly looking for ways to expand our coverage in Irish Sign Language. So, what were the results of our efforts and how do we measure them? Well, it's very difficult to be specific, especially when I tell you that as a channel, we do not measure our audience ratings. Whenever I tell that to friends when I'm out with them, I usually get a whistle and a raised eyebrow accompanied by a comment usually along the lines of, well, you wouldn't want to measure them, would you? It's very easy to be cynical, but there are very good reasons as to why we don't. Firstly, we don't have the budget for it. TAM and Nielsen measuring is quite expensive in comparison to our total yearly budget, and the more we have for production, the better. Secondly, we are not unusual in not measuring ratings. Most of the parliamentary channels I have been in contact with do not do so. Parliamentary broadcasting is the purest form of public service broadcasting. Ratings, or the comparative lack thereof, or ratings for certain items of business and not for others, could theoretically lead to political pressure being applied to editorial or programming decisions for any of these stations. But there are other measurements we can apply to give us an idea of how our material is being received. My colleague Karen Hooley from the Oireachtas web team keeps very detailed metrics of how our content is consumed online. All of our streams on our website, 7, made up of Oireachtas TV and the 6 separate chambers, were consumed by viewers for a total of 337,639 hours in 2022. 95,000 of those hours were for the Oireachtas TV stream alone. Content consumed on our social media channels and our app totalled 103,930 hours. Oireachtas TV made up 32,524 hours of that total. Oireachtas TV is now the most used and most promoted stream on our website. But engagement and impact can't only be measured in numbers. We play to 2 audiences, our viewers and our owners. Remember, we are owned by the Parliament. While we are apolitical, every one of the legislators have a say through the Commission of the House of the Oireachtas about how we go about our business. While televising proceedings is taken as read, the need for balance in our ancillary programming is something that could easily be used as a political football if a member so wished. This has never happened in the 7 years I've been here. The Ceann Comhairle, the Speaker of the House, Seán Farrell, and the Commission of the Oireachtas have supported us unfailingly, but not unquestioningly. We have been backed in all our initiatives by the Secretary-General of the House of the Oireachtas Service, Peter Finnegan, his staff, and the other sections. And rank-and-file members usually give us full cooperation and support. They would not do that unless there was an internal recognition of the worth and usefulness of the projects that we promote. We needed all that support when our greatest test as a channel came during COVID, when we were the only parliament that I know of to relocate their main legislative chamber for health and safety reasons to a location off-site, while still maintaining plenary sittings for the Seanad and committee meetings in Leinster House. Working across 2 sites and with the help of staff across the sections in the service and partners in the independent production sector, we made sure every part of the proceedings were broadcast and recorded during the time of the greatest peril our country had faced since perhaps the time of our civil war. As I said earlier, you may never need parliamentary broadcasting, but when you do, it is there. To look to the future, as mentioned earlier, we own our own process end to end. And while this gives us the ability to be laser focused on promoting the Parliament, it also means we can't rely on big companies like the BBC or C-SPAN or CPAC to do the thinking for us when it comes to how content will be consumed in the coming years. We are already moving to IP, and while this improves the quality of pictures delivered, gives us new internal delivery pathways to other sections in the Oireachtas, it also leaves us in a position to move in new directions externally in a time of great uncertainty for the industry. The proliferation of streaming giants has led the providers of broadcast platforms like Sky TV, Virgin Media to rethink how they incorporate content from those giants on their platforms. Along with this, the development of more sophisticated OTT player technology, which most of the terrestrial channels have engaged with, means that there are content streams being accessed more and more by people which are unconnected with the regularly scheduled programme guide. Does the future look more like an aggregate of apps like the RTE player or the BBC iPlayer or all 4? What does that mean for a channel whose core function is the showing of live proceedings, more live content than any other channel in Ireland, that can run over schedule regularly? Is the future the development of an OTT service that can be incorporated within existing structures, or can stand alone, receiving traffic from and directing people to oireachtas.ie? As always, we have to play smart. We can't kid ourselves. We are a small, publicly funded parliamentary channel, and it is neither possible nor appropriate for us to play at being at the bleeding edge of the technical development in the broadcast world. But we can do 2 things. Firstly, we can be watchful and thoughtful in how we choose to develop our existing infrastructure. Being cognizant of the coming trends means that while we may not jump first, we can jump just after. Public engagement means dealing with people where they live. Judging where that will be in terms of digital broadcast in 10 years' time and devising smart and efficient ways to get us there is one of the main components of our job here in Oireachtas TV. And secondly, and finally, and apologetically for all the problems that I had at the start of this speech, we can be confident. I mentioned earlier, in the brutal terms of the marketplace, public engagement with Parliament, I believe, is about selling to people and believing in your product. Well, we do that. We think this sells. We think that democracy and the transparent broadcast of its execution will always have a market, as we saw just this weekend in the House of the Representatives in the US through C-SPAN. The last few years has shown us, in ways we never thought we could experience, that while we may be told that we live in a world dominated by global corporate interests, when it comes down to the wire, it is the people's representatives in parliaments all over the world that had to make decisions, for good or ill, to get our societies through. And the people will always want to see and hold accountable their representatives for what they do. Put bluntly, democracy sells itself. And with a product like that, where could we go wrong?